we now cross live to Abuja, where the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Dr. Zainab Ahmed, is presenting a breakdown of the highlights of the 2023 Appropriation Act. Stay with us. It's still the Arise News channel.
The real GDP was projected to be 3.75% in 2023, compared to 4.37% that we had projected in the medium-term development plan. Growth is expected to moderate to 3.3% in 2024 before it picks up again to 3.46% in 2025. Inflation rate is projected to average 17.16% in 2023, so we're expecting inflation to moderate and begin to go down, and by the end of 2023, it should average 17.16%, and also further decline to 14.93%. This is, of course, our projections. We're hoping that the Russia-Ukraine war abates and that the global economic growth projection improves, or at least stays at the current assumption level, that it does not decline. So at slide 18, the projected fiscal outcomes in the 2023 budget is based on petroleum subsidy reform ratio, and that is to say, in the 2023 framework, we had assumed, and the National Assembly had approved, that the petroleum subsidy would remain up to the middle of 2023, based on the 18 months extension announced early in 2022. In this regard, only 3.36 trillion has been provided for PMS subsidy in the 2023 budget. There will also be tighter enforcement of the performance management framework for government-owned enterprises that will result in further increase in operating surpluses and dividend remittances in 2023. The monitoring that we have been doing has been yielding results, as you have seen earlier in the performance of the independent revenues of 2022. So the total revenue available at slide 19 to fund the 2023 FGM budget is estimated at 10.49 trillion naira, and this includes gross revenues of 63 government-owned enterprises totaling 3.87 trillion. Of this, federal government oil revenue share is projected to be 2.29 trillion, non-oil taxes at 2.43 trillion, and federal government independent revenues at 2.64 trillion. Other revenues totaling 762 billion are also projected in the 2023 revenues of 10.49 trillion. So in aggregate, 22% of the projected revenues are expected from oil-related sources, while 78% is to be earned from the non-oil resources. If you recall, I remember the first budget that we passed, last 2026 budget, the oil revenue was 70%, while non-oil revenue was 30%. So we are very happy that we've been able to turn things around and turn the story to the opposite direction, that today only 22% of government revenue is contributed by the oil sector. At slide 20 is an analysis of this revenue, and I will leave you to look at this at your time. I had just briefly presented what the revenues are. You will see details of what these revenue lines are, and they include the share of the oil revenue, contribution of dividends from the NLNG, Bank of Industry, and a few others, share of non-oil taxes, contribution of CIT, VAT, customs, as well as other federation levies, share of electronic money transfer, which is projected to be 19.088 billion naira in 2023, compared to 29.367 billion naira in 2022. There's also the share of revenues from the government-owned enterprises at 3.8 trillion, and then operating surpluses, that is remittances that we are expecting from the GOEs at 1.47 trillion, independent revenues 2.615 trillion, and several others that are detailed in the report. So at slide 21 is an overview of the 2023 federal government expenditures. The 2023 federal government expenditures, inclusive of government-owned enterprises and project-tied loans, is projected to be 21.83 trillion, which is 20% higher than the amended budget of 2022. The recurrent non-debt spending estimated to be 8.33 trillion, inclusive of 200 billion for the National Social Investment Program. Aggregate capital expenditure of 6.46 trillion is 30% of total expenditure, and also 3.5% lower than the 2022 budget, inclusive of capital component of statutory transfers, government-owned enterprises capital, as well as project-tied loans. At 6.31 trillion, debt service is 29% of total government expenditure. At 6.31%, debt service is 29% of total government expenditure. This is 71% higher than the estimate for 2022, and it includes interest repayment of 1.2 trillion for the CBN overdraft that is popularly called the ways and means. So the details of this expenditure are on slide 22. I invite you to get a copy of this presentation from the website and look at the details. You will see that statutory transfers is 967 billion, debt service is 6.309 trillion, higher than 3.685 trillion projected in the 2022 budget. There is a sinking fund provision, as well as recurrent non-debt expenditure that has increased from 7.108 trillion to 8.32 trillion. And also, there is aggregate capital expenditure that has declined from 6.681 trillion to 6.445 trillion. So total expenditure of 21.82 trillion, which is the size of the federal government expenditure budget. At slide 23 is an update, is a report on the fiscal deficit and also our plan for financing the fiscal deficit. So the overall fiscal deficit is 11.34 trillion for 2023, and this represents 5.03% of the GDP. The deficit, the budget deficit, is to be financed mainly by borrowings, and this includes 7.04 trillion from domestic sources, 1.76 trillion from foreign sources, and 1.77 trillion from multilateral, bilateral loan drawdowns. These are loans that have already been acquired and are being implemented. The drawings from the loan projection is 1.77%. Then privatization proceeds of 206.18 billion naira. The gap between revenue and additional financing and total expenditure amounting to 553.46 billion is being expected to be financed by additional revenue from spectrum fees and also from tax from the maritime sector. You recall when the president was presenting the budget yesterday, he did mention that there's a gap of 553 billion that has not been adjusted in the fiscal framework, and has directed the ministry to work with the National Assembly to fix that. During the appropriation process, the National Assembly identified additional revenues that will be realized from GSM spectrum license, which was not in what we submitted, as well as additional revenues that can be realized from the maritime sector. but the fiscal framework was not adjusted, and we realized that very, very, very late. So, ladies and gentlemen, slide 24 is just a picture to show what I had explained earlier in terms of the deficit, and also just to call attention to the fact that the deficit to GDP ratio is 5.03%, which is higher than the 3% as stipulated by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And we're working with the National Assembly to determine what we need to do, whether or not we need to amend that provision of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, because several countries have actually done that. In the times in which we live in today, that 3% is no longer realistic. So we are working with the National Assembly, the possibility of doing just that. So in terms of debt management, again, I'm sure the audience here is familiar with our medium-term debt management strategy, which has some fiscal sustainability measures, including that public debt as a percentage of GDP should not be more than 40%. Domestic and external debt ratio should be 70-30. So at public debt to GDP, we have 22.8%. This is as at 2022, but this has since moved on to 35.33%. Once we, this is as of September, once we adjust to the ways and means that has already been approved to be securitized. So once we bring it in, this will take us to 35.33%. The average tenor of the loans also is still within 10 years, 10.7, 10.28, which is the actual, but we have also progressively worked on improving that so that the minimum tenor is 10 years, but we also have some instruments now that are as long as 30 years. Let me then move us on to slide 27, which is just explaining that we have had to issue some federal government guarantees. And federal government guarantees, even though they are not direct borrowing of the federal government, they're still contingent liability of government. And we take them in to report the size of government deficit. So far, what we have as a percentage of the GDP of federal government guarantees is 2.64% as at November 2022. And we're not planning on debt restructuring. Nigeria has remained committed to meeting its obligations and has consistently been able to meet both its domestic and external obligations. And our projections in the medium term is that this will continue to be so. The federal government will continue to utilize appropriate debt management tools to streamline the costs as well as the risk profile in the debt, including through concessionary borrowings, spreading out debt maturities to make sure that you don't have a bunching, that you don't have too much to repay at any particular point in time, reprofiling the maturities by refinancing short-term debt using longer-term instruments. So moving forward to the Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative at slide 30. The initiative, of course, since 2019 that we launched it, has been designed to improve tax revenues from both oil as well as non-oil sources. And I must say that we have achieved remarkable results in improving non-oil revenues. We've also seen significant improvements in revenues from the Nigerian Customs Service, and also very, very remarkable improvements in revenues from government-owned enterprises. At slide 32 is to remind us that this administration, and this is the 4th year, has adopted a practice, if you like, a tradition of finance bills to support the implementation of the annual budget. And consistent with this practice, the 2022 finance bill has the focus of ensuring tax equity and a couple of provisions that would enhance tax equity, including being able to clarify that 35% of the electronic money transfer levy is also to be shared with the local government. When we passed the first amendment on the electronic money transfer levy, and the mention in the act was for states, so the states were excluding the local government. So this is just to emphasize that the sharing includes the local government. There's also the second focus, which is climate change and green growth. And this is designed for us to complement non-fiscal reforms to reduce greenhouse emissions and also to support the facilitation of domestic and international investments in climate adaptation as well as mitigation, and enhance the opportunities in green growth as well as in job creation. There's also the focus of job creation itself as well as economic growth, and the design is to implement very important public procurement reforms that will enhance government priority expenditure, to also fund on a sustainable basis multilateral institutions that Nigeria belongs to in order to qualify for increased funding and other reforms from these multilateral agencies, and to complement, of course, the ease of doing business reforms. Reforming tax incentives is a commitment that we have made, and we started working on it already. We're phasing out antiquated corporate income tax incentives for matured industries, and maybe people popularly just understand when you say pioneer tax. We have pioneer tax provisions that are dated to 1958 or something. So there are some industries from that schedule at that time that were classified as infant, and we're saying they have grown, they need to exit, and we need to bring real infant industries to benefit. Such industries are industries that are now growing in the IT sector that didn't used to exist, that need these opportunities, and we're glad that the startup bill also emphasizes that. So we will be exiting some industries from incentives like pioneer tax, and we are aware that it is not going to be a very popular thing to do, but it's a must do for us. As at 2021, the tax expenditure of government was 6 trillion naira. So that is 6 trillion naira revenue foregone in terms of different kind of tax incentives, tax holidays, exemptions of import duties, different kind of waivers. That's revenue that could have remained with government. While we appreciate the need to provide incentives to encourage industry, but we have to create a balance that we're not giving out too much without getting much into the economy in return. So last focus of the finance bill is the revenue generation and tax administration, an obvious one, of course, combating tax evasion and aggressive tax planning, aligning the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021 with the Petroleum Tax Administration, so that the two taxes are in alignment with each other. So we're not making any changes in the PIA. We're just amending the current tax laws to make sure they align to the provisions in the PIA, the Petroleum Industry Act. We are also, again, complementing the ease of doing business. The Finance Bill 2022 has amended 11 different tax laws. You can see them on the screen at slide 33. And the details of the finance bill itself, once it's assented into law, will be available for public examination. So at slide 35 is starting to speak on the critical sectoral allocations in the 2023 budget. We have, of course, statutory transfers, which are in an aggregate sum of 967.5 billion provided as statutory transfers, and this represents an increase of 223.38 billion over the executive budget proposal, which means there were some increases at the appropriation level. So within the whole of these statutory transfers, there is 228.1 billion for National Assembly, 173.6 billion for INEC, 165 billion for the Judicial Council of Nigeria, that's the judiciary arm of government, 119.9 billion for NDDC, Niger Delta Development Commission, 103.3 billion for UBEC, Universal Basic Education, 59 billion for NEDC, Northeast Development Commission, 51.6 billion for the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund, and 51.6 billion for NASENI, and 10.7 billion for Public Complaints Commission, and 4.5 billion for National Human Rights Commission. Slide 36 is a continuation of some of the critical allocations in the budget. For the education sector, the total allocation is 1.79 trillion, representing 8.2% of the FGM budget. And this includes 972.93 billion for the main ministry itself, both its recurrent and capital, as well as its agencies. Then 103.29 billion for UBEC, 248.27 billion for TET Fund, as well as 470 billion for the provisions that we have made for tertiary education revitalization, as well as salary enhancement. So 1.79 trillion, representing 8.2% for the education sector. For the health sector, on the other hand, the total provision is 1.15 trillion, representing 5.3% of the budget, of the FGN budget. And this includes 102 trillion for the ministry and its agencies, 76.99 billion for Gavi immunization, including counterpart funding for donor-supported programs, as well as Global Fund. There is also a provision of 51.64 billion that is the statutory transfer for the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund. Other sectors, critical sectors in the 2023 budget, allocations for defense and security sector, 2.98%, representing 13.4% of the budget. And this amount includes military, police, intelligence, as well as paramilitary agencies. Infrastructure agencies, including works and housing, power, transport, water resources, aviation, 1.24 trillion, representing 5.7% of the budget. Social development and poverty reduction programs, 809.32 billion, representing 3.7%. And these amounts are provisions for the social investment program, as well as the poverty reduction programs of government. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2023 budget, again, was prepared amidst very challenging world economy. Like other countries of the world, our economy faces headwinds from these factors, compounded in our case by pockets of domestic security challenges. Fiscal risks globally are elevated following weaker than expected economic performance, as well as structural issues that are adversely impacting our domestic economy. However, interventionists and reflationary measures have significantly moderated the impact of these current challenges. The early passage of the 2023 budget is critical to effective delivery of government's legacy projects, achievements of macro, fiscal, and sectoral objectives, smooth transition program, and effective takeoff of the incoming administration. To achieve these objectives, the Budget Office will intensify our revenue mobilization efforts and intensify current efforts towards the realization of crude oil production as well as export targets. We will continue to augment available resources by accelerating the implementation of public-private partnership initiatives, especially those designed to fast-track the pace of our infrastructure development. However, government remains mindful and committed to the need to provide safety nets to cushion the impact of reform measures on the vulnerable segments of our society. The implementation of these critical measures that are aimed at further improving the Nigerian business environment, as well as enhancing the welfare of our people and ensuring sustainable medium to long-term growth, will be accelerated. We, of course, welcome citizens' participation in enhancing budget implementation, in enhancing budget monitoring. And we invite you to visit our platforms at iMonitor in the Budget Office website, Citizens Budget Monitoring also, which you can find at Google Store, and then the new iMac that was recently launched 2 weeks ago by His Excellency the President, which you will find also in the website of the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning, the planning arm of the ministry. The details of the approved 2023 budget are also available on the websites of the ministry. I invite you to interrogate the details of the budget and to give us your feedback. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Good morning.
If you know it's not easy to deliver that, you can do better. Revenues drive expenditures. What are highlights on the budget of fiscal consolidation and transition?